Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. Based on the fact that you clicked this video, I deduce that you are either a fan of this show, or you're a fan of Sherlock Holmes and came across this video in your travels across the internet. Sherlock Holmes is one of the most famous characters in all of literature. Even if you've never read any of the stories featuring him written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you have no doubt seen one of the many adaptations or parodies of the character that is throughout popular culture, such as CBS's Elementary, or the BBC's Sherlock, Disney's The Great Mouse Detective, Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd Century, or my personal favorite, Star Trek The Next Generation's Elementary, My Dear Data, and Ship in a Bottle, to name just a few. The character is endured to the modern day partly because of the character being sort of in the public domain and thus anyone can use him, but also because the character is an interesting one and has proved throughout pop culture to be very versatile. It's why there can be two modern day adaptations of the character running at the same time. They're so very different, yet they contain the same source material. Trust me, I could do an entire episode on just cataloging all the different adaptations. Which is a neat idea. But that's not what we're here to talk about. Several years ago, I talked about The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, and I always intended to go back to where it all began, and I've owned the entire collection of Sherlock Holmes for over a year, but I just never got around to doing anything with it. Until now. But before we start, I suppose I do owe you some sort of history lesson about Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was born in Scotland in 1859 to Irish Catholic parents. Before becoming an author, Doyle was studying to be a physician and studied practical botany. He started writing short stories during that time and later got his degree in 1881 and practiced medicine, first with a friend and then struck out on his own. Fun fact, Doyle was also a staunch advocate of compulsory vaccination. While his independent practice struggled, Doyle continued to write, and in 1886, the publisher Ward Lock and Company took today's story, A Study in Scarlet, paying Doyle £25 for the rights, which translates to about £2,500 today. Not bad, considering that neither of them knew that Holmes would become such a phenomenon. The story is the first appearance of, who is probably his most famous character, Sherlock Holmes and his assistant, Dr. John Watson, and received rather good reviews during its time from both the Scotsman and the Glasgow Herald. Holmes was based off an old teacher of Doyle's, Joseph Bell, who lectured at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Bell was also a pioneer in the field of forensic science, specifically forensic pathology, and insisted that medical students should wash their hands before examining pregnant women, which saved many lives that would have otherwise been cut short due to infection or disease. I bring that up not because it's relevant to Sherlock Holmes, but because I'm taking a forensics class, and so I found that to be a neat tidbit of information and wanted to share it. I think that pretty much covers it. So, is the first appearance of Sherlock Holmes as much of a classic as it should be? Or is it one of those stories that was good at the time but doesn't really hold up well? Let's find out. This is A Study in Scarlet. No cover to speak of, because it's one of those older books that has a whole lot of covers, but none of the ones I've seen are particularly amazing or bad, or have anything to really poke fun at. The most interesting one I found was a re-release of the book featuring Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman on the cover, which makes sense because the story did inspire a few elements that Moffat used in Sherlock's A Study in Pink. Not necessarily a good or bad cover, just kind of humorous that a reprint uses the image of an adaptation on it, and not even a direct adaptation either. The story revolves around Dr. John Watson and his attempt to reacclimate himself to civilian life after serving in the military in Afghanistan. While looking for lodging, a friend manages to tell him of one of his acquaintances who is looking for a roommate to save on costs of renting a room, though John is warned that this guy is a little bit weird. John is pretty desperate, so he meets with the friend, a consultant for Scotland Yard named Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock is very good at deduction and is able to deduce John's military background within seconds of meeting him, which impresses John. Sherlock and John detail their own eccentricities to each other and then make a plan to rent a room at 221B Baker Street together. The story is told from the perspective of Watson, so we get a few pages of Watson explaining the living situation and how he's curious at what Sherlock does. Sherlock tells him of his consultancy and tells him that he's an expert in deductive reasoning, showing off his skills when the messenger comes by, and Sherlock is able to glean his entire background from the way he holds himself along with his outfit. Sherlock is called out onto a case, but because he's forced to be a silent partner on the case as he works for Scotland Yard, he wants to decline, but John wants him to reconsider because of his skill. Sherlock relents and wants John to assist him, inviting him to the crime scene, which is being investigated by Inspectors Lestrade and Gregson. They're lost as to what to do and need Sherlock's help. Sherlock looks around, seeing the body of the victim, Enoch Drebber, and finding out that the word race is written in the wall in blood, yet the deceased has no wounds that would have produced the blood, and they wonder what sort of person would do that.
Someone who badly needed a pen.
Lestrade and Gregson believe that the blood is the killer's and that this was a crime of passion in the name of Rachel, and the killer just didn't have time to finish writing before he left. Sherlock, however, points out that Rache is the German word for revenge, and Sherlock has figured out from inspecting the road leading up to the crime scene, an abandoned house, in addition to the scene itself, that the killer arrived in a taxi, wore a specific type of boot, smoked a certain type of cigar, had long fingernails, and that the Rache thing is just a diversion to trick the police. Sherlock moves the body and a wedding ring tumbles out, which Sherlock gives to the police as they go to talk to the constable who discovered the body, learning of a strange drunk man who showed up at the crime scene, which piques Sherlock's interest, as Sherlock deduces that the drunk was the killer and came back incognito to find the wedding ring, which he had erroneously left behind, and so starts the first case of Sherlock and Watson, trying to discover the identity of Mr. Drebber's killer. After a failed plot to use the fake ring to lure the killer out, and a talk with the woman renting rooms to Drebber and his secretary, Joseph Stangerson, at her boarding house, finding out that he had made unkind advances toward the innkeeper's daughter, which raised ire from the brother, which got the brother arrested by Scotland Yard, they discover that another murder has occurred. Stangerson is dead, but it wasn't the innkeeper's son who was in custody when it occurred. Sherlock also manages to glean that Drebber was murdered by way of poison, found in a small case at the crime scene. Sherlock manages to capture the killer, a taxi driver named Jefferson Hope, by using his gang of street urchins to lure him to 221B Baker Street, and he reveals his backstory, which involves a man named Joseph Ferrier and his daughter Lucy. They were traveling west, and everyone in their group died except them, and right when they were almost goners, they were saved by some kindly Mormons, led by Brigham Young. Yes, that Brigham Young, who only asked that they convert to Mormonism in repayment, which they did, living in the community for several years in Salt Lake City. Years later, Lucy falls in love with a man named Jefferson Hope, an outsider, and they're engaged to be married. The Mormons don't take too kindly to that, Young informing Ferrier that it's against their religion to marry outside the Mormon faith, and that she will either wed Enoch Drebber or Joseph Stangerson. Ferrier refuses, but Young tells him that she has a month to decide, and they take that month seriously, leaving notes counting down the days all around their farm. Nearing the deadline, Hope returns and whisks them away, trying to head back across America to safety. Unfortunately, while he's out hunting, the Mormons track them down and kill Joseph, taking Lucy back to Utah and forcibly marrying her to Drebber, where she died of a broken heart a month later before Hope could rescue her, though he sneaks to where her body is kept and takes her wedding ring as a reminder. Vowing revenge, he went all Batman and trained to be able to kill the men responsible for his love's death, but suffers from an aortic aneurysm and so can't take immediate action, as he has to recuperate. And when he does, he finds that a schism has occurred and Drebber and Stangerson have fled to Cleveland. He tries and fails to murder them there, causing them to relocate to London, where he finally manages to track down Drebber by pretending to be a taxi driver and gets him into his coach. Drebber is a drunk, so it wasn't that hard. And he takes Drebber to the abandoned house to murder him, forcing him to pick a capsule out of a box. Some are poison and some aren't, and Hope believes that if the universe was fair, Drebber will pick the poison and Hope will not, which is exactly what occurs. Hope suffers from nosebleeds, so when his nose started gushing, he wrote "Rage" on the wall to throw off the police, as Sherlock has deduced. He lost the ring, went back as the drunk, and then had an accomplice pretend to be an old woman in order to steal it back from Sherlock and Watson, who attempted to lure him to 221B Baker Street by placing a missing ad for the ring. Then he went to attack Stangerson the same way, but Stangerson wouldn't take a pill, so he was forced to stab him. He's taken into Scotland Yard to await trial, but he dies of the aneurysm before he can face any sort of consequences. His revenge mission finally completed. When it's reported as Sherlock had predicted, Gregson and Lestrade take full credit, and when Sherlock rebukes Watson's idea to publish his own account, Watson decides to do it himself as the story ends. These characters have endured throughout time and literature and are utterly brilliant. I like how we're introduced to Watson and how we get his unique flavor throughout the story, since he's the primary narrator outside of Jefferson Hope's backstory. Doyle could have very well written it from the third person and had an omniscient narrator, but I think that this makes a much bigger impact, and I feel more connected to the story since I'm hearing it from one of the participants themselves. Sherlock is shown here as actually a sort of genial guy. Most adaptations of the stories will show Sherlock to be brusque and not willing to suffer fools gladly, going so far as to sometimes be a dick to their respective Watsons. But in this, despite the warning from their mutual friend, Sherlock is a pretty nice guy. I mean, think about it. He initially doesn't want to help Scotland Yard because they keep shafting him on the credit. Most other Sherlock Holmes stories show Sherlock as liking being left out of the limelight, but this one shows that he doesn't like that Gregson and Lestrade steal his credit. He also doesn't do nearly as many crazy and insane things as later versions of the character would do. For a detective who takes strange company as clients and employs street urchins to serve under him, otherwise, he's a pretty normal dude. The most he does that could be considered dickery is when Watson insults the idea of deduction and he completely blows Watson's mind by proving it right there. Sherlock's personality is, however, very similar to the adaptations in the sense that when Lestrade and Gregson try to speculate based on their limited knowledge, Sherlock blows them out of the water with his superior knowledge, explaining that they're wrong and here's why. Watson's character is also really well written. You get a real sense of the character from the narration, and he's exactly as Watson has always been, the straight man to Holmes's antics. His purpose in this one, apart from being the one who's there to be flabbergasted by Holmes's brilliance, is to allow us to have a lens into the life of Holmes from someone who doesn't know him, and can objectively depict the events of the story, a goal which I think is achieved. Another interesting thing is that since I hadn't really explored the books before, I see Lestrade and Gregson as very removed from each other, since one is the primary police contact in the BBC adaptation, and the other is the primary police contact in the CBS one, respectively. But in this, they're working together. Just an interesting thing I noticed. Lestrade and Gregson are sort of samey in this one, two police officers, and aren't very distinct, apart from both having a very different method of solving the case. Lestrade going straight to Sherlock, and Gregson striking out on his own to discover clues. I still prefer Gregson, but really only because of Elementary. Jefferson Hope is a really good antagonist because his case is very ambiguous. On the one hand, yes, he murdered someone, but some would say that it was justified based on what Drebber and Stangerson did in the past. It's interesting from a morality standpoint, and instead of being a clean-cut, black-and-white case of good versus evil, it makes you think. Did Hope escape justice, or did he deliver it, with death being his reward? Obviously, murder is wrong. I'm just saying that Doyle delivered a layered antagonist, and in his first published work. Adding on to that, as far as I can tell, we're definitely intended to believe that Hope is the good guy, since we get the crazy backstory as a significant part of the second half of the book. John's narration takes a backseat to it, so it's a major piece. On to that backstory. Now, from what I can tell, Doyle's portrayal of the Mormon faith, well, he may have taken some artistic liberties. It pretty much characterizes all the Mormons as evil, amoral psychopaths. Some of it sounds like standard religious nutjobbery, don't marry outside the faith or whatever, and I have no way of knowing if that's what it was really like back then, but knowing what I do know about storytelling, I'm sure not all of it was as entirely accurate to real life as Doyle would want you to believe. Though apparently Doyle actually visited Utah in 1923 and admitted that, regardless of what he wrote, which he staunchly believed was based in historical fact, that the Mormons around in the 1920s were not the same Mormons that he had written about decades prior. But remember, this was in a pre-internet, pre-information age where the only stuff he could find about the Mormons was what was published and available in England at the time, so those writers could have also taken some license in what they wrote. What I'm getting at is that I can't verify which is the true story for all my detective work I tried to do. I can only talk about it based on what I've read. The villains, victims, Drebber and Stangerson, were characterized as miserable, disgusting characters who probably deserve their fate, considering that they killed the farriers, who we are made very much to like. And Jefferson Hope is the hero of the story, despite being the murderer, and to his credit, unlike other revenge-driven killers, there is absolutely no collateral damage in this. He kills his targets, and no one else. Though I guess the innkeeper's son is wrongfully detained, and then there's that sick dog that Sherlock puts down with Hope's poison pills. But other than that, the story is told very well and had a great pacing. A lot of older stuff can be slow burn, but this was edge-of-the-seat excitement. Considering how much I've said this was a bit of a slog during the last 5 classic novel months, this was a welcome surprise in terms of pacing. This also doesn't feature any old-timey racism, unlike a lot of other writing of the time, and even writing that's more modern than this. Good on Doyle for that. It completely takes me out of a story to have to read the old-timey racism, but there was none of that here. I also like the way that the format of the story was given, being from Watson's perspective, apart from Hope's backstory, because it makes the bit about Hope's backstory even more striking. When I was reading it, I swear I started a completely different story until I saw the name Jefferson Hope and realized it was a part of the main one. In doing so, it made me pay attention more to the story because I was looking for familiar names that would tie back into the Holmes and Watson plot. I don't know if that's a trend with Doyle's early work, but I really hope it is, because it is really damn cool. The story is a classic, and I would be a pretty bad book reviewer if I didn't recommend this book. Is the portrayal of Mormons flawed? Probably, but that doesn't diminish the fact that the story perfectly encapsulates the personalities of the protagonists, and is formatted in a very intuitive way that makes the story enjoyable. I'd take its portrayal of Mormons with a grain of salt, but other than that, the story is utterly phenomenal. It's engaging, has a pacing that won't turn off modern readers, and one of the things that makes Sherlock Holmes so enduring is, despite taking place in the past, it's an utterly timeless story. Overall, A Study in Scarlet was a brilliant start to the long canon of Sherlock Holmes, and you don't need to be a detective to figure that out. That joke was terrible. Who writes this crap? Well, either way, dressed like this, I feel like I want to go out and solve a mystery. In the meantime, if you'd like to see more of the Literary Lair, you can hit that subscribe button. And if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comments section below. Oh, and if you want to be notified of new uploads, you can hit that bell icon. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. Next week, in preparation for Avengers Infinity War, we're looking at the first Marvel cinematic sequel, Iron Man 2. But don't go just yet, because the week after, we're going to be looking at a Star Trek book. And you guys get to choose the book. We've got 3 choices this time. 2 featuring facets of the franchise that I don't cover that often, and 1 from familiar authors. First up, we've got House of Cards, the first Star Trek New Frontier novella from Peter David. Then we have The Children of Kings, which features Pike, Spock, and Dr. Boyce in a The Cage-era Trek story. And finally, we have The Price of the Phoenix, a TOS-era story from Sandra Marshak and Myrna Colbreth, who gave us the utterly forgettable Triangle. Either go to my Patreon or to the Google forum to cast your vote. The polls close when the Iron Man 2 video goes live on YouTube. Hope you pick a good one. See you next time. Where he finally manages to track down Drebber by pretending to be a taxi driver. Good on Doyle for that. It completely takes me out of a story to have to read the old-timey racism, but there was none of that here. I also like the way that the format of the story was given from...